Marshman. I'm the President and Chief Executive Officer of Toronto Community Housing. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our building and my honor to serve as the MC. I want to begin today by acknowledging that the land that we are gathered on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the New Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now the home of many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto was covered by Treaty 13 of the Mississaugas of the New Credit. Following today's announcement by Minister Clark, I will invite Mayor John Tory to say a few words, and then we will open up the floor for questions. I now invite Ontario's Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing, the Honourable Steve Clark, to deliver remarks on behalf of the Province of Ontario. Mr. Clark.
Thanks very much, Kevin, Your Worship. It's great to be here with you, Deputy Mayor, as well. Nice to see you here. The city and the province, we have many shared priorities. That's why I'm so pleased that recently we renewed the Toronto-Ontario Cooperation and Consultation Agreement. Because when governments work together, good things happen for people. The City of Toronto came to us with concerns about community safety. It's an issue that's been top of mind for both of our governments. There are thousands of community housing buildings right across this province, places where over 250,000 Ontarians call home. A home is more than bricks and mortar. It's where people should be able to relax, to get to know their neighbors, to raise their family, and peace. But some who live in community housing don't feel safe. They're afraid to go out after dark or even let their kids play on the front yard. We've seen the troubling news reports over the summer and even last week. Toronto has experienced a wave of violence in community housing. And I know that Mayor Tory and members of the City Council, they've been very vocal about this. The previous government refused to take action, but we know people are feeling scared, and they're feeling unsafe in their communities. That's why I'm here today, to announce that our government is making community housing safer, especially for vulnerable seniors and for children. Municipalities and housing providers have told us that when they evict tenants from community housing for committing a crime, some simply move right back in some cases, even in the same building. These are serious crimes like drug trafficking, committing acts of violence, or human trafficking. So we're giving housing providers the tools needed to keep their buildings safe. Starting today, if a tenant has been evicted for illegal activities and they try to come back into community housing, housing providers can say no. If they pose a threat to the community, housing providers can turn them away, keep them out, and make sure that they're building a safe place for their tenants to live and play once again. Our government is sending a very clear message that dangerous criminal activity is not welcome in community housing. It puts our communities, our families at risk. And people shouldn't have to worry about their children's safety when they're playing right outside their front door. I want to commend Mayor Tory for the investments that the city is making into community-focused initiatives aimed at reducing gun violence and the appeal of crime, especially for our youth. Our government is investing $25 million over 4 years to fight against guns and gang violence in the city of Toronto. But to address the community safety challenges across the province, we need to take a comprehensive approach. Community safety was one part of our Ontario's community housing renewal strategy. Our government's plan to transform a fragmented and inefficient system into one that's streamlined, sustainable, and ready to help those most vulnerable in our communities. Transformation will take time, so we're starting with these steps that will make a big difference for tenants and housing providers. We're removing rules that punish tenants who work or go to college or university, so they can seek opportunities, accept work, and go to school so that they can become more economically self-sufficient. We're simplifying Ontario's complex and cumbersome rent calculations replacing a formula with more than 60 factors, and that requires piles of paperwork, and we're basing rents on tenants' income tax return information instead. We're removing rules that penalize tenants who receive child support payments, and we're making sure units don't sit empty, with the waiting list for community housing growing and growing. I'm so pleased to say my ministry is providing $1 billion this year to help maintain, repair, and grow community housing, to help people who are on the streets, get them into stable housing, and to continue to support off-reserve Indigenous housing. Despite the financial mess that our government inherited from the previous one, we're putting people first and protecting critical programs like housing to some of our most vulnerable, because all Ontarians deserve a safe place to call home. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. I appreciate that. I'm going to call on the Mayor to say a few words, and then I will say a few words. Thank you. Well, good afternoon. Whoops, there goes my glass. That's all right. I don't need to. Thank you very much. Let's snag it. Let's just pick up my glass. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is great to be at the TCHC head office and to be joined here by Deputy Mayor Ana Bailào, by Minister Steve Clark, and by Kevin Marshman, of course, the CEO of the TCHC. Today's announcement is a very important one, and it will have a positive impact on many people who live in our city, particularly those who live in Toronto community housing. The changes will take place in a number of different areas. For several years, I've been advocating for safer community housing. The moment I was elected as mayor, I immediately moved to have a task force look into Toronto community housing and what changes we could make to improve the lot and life of the tenants there, and we did, under the leadership of Senator Art Eggleton, probably the single most extensive consultation ever done among tenants of community housing, and what they told us that their number one concern was safety. That was true then, when that consultation took place a couple of years ago, and I know it is still true today. I know that Toronto community housing itself has worked hard to improve the safety of tenants since the conduct of that consultation and the receipt of the report. As we speak, the corporation is investing additional millions in safety measures, starting with the neighborhoods where the problem of criminal activity and safety concerns has been most challenging. But we knew that the TCHC and the city could not address this problem alone, on their own, and there was more to be done. Every single day, far too many residents of Toronto community housing continued to feel unsafe in their own homes because criminals were being let back into their buildings after eviction for criminal behavior. They had already been evicted for criminal behavior, and they had rights, and in some cases special rights, to get back in to the housing. This is an absolutely unacceptable situation, which people evicted from TCHC housing for criminal behavior actually had a right to get back in. And so 1 year ago, I sent Minister Clark a letter to reiterate this message on behalf of residents and to seek a change in the regulations which allowed such a nonsensical result. This letter was similar to one that I had sent to his predecessors in the previous government, and it made it clear that we would need changes to provincial legislation and regulations in order to give Toronto community housing the discretion to bar tenants who had already been evicted for criminal behavior. And now our call has been answered by the Government of Ontario and by Minister Steve Clark. And so I want to thank the provincial government for coming forward and supporting safer housing for the residents of Toronto, and for enacting a critical change in legislation that will benefit people in other parts of the province as well. Thank you to the provincial government for tightening up the rules that will allow for the barring of criminals from Toronto community housing after they've already been evicted once for criminal behavior. These changes will now allow TCHC to say to people who have already been evicted for serious criminal behavior, no, you are not coming back to terrorize the good people who live in the building where you once lived and from which you were evicted. No longer will these people be able to take advantage of this vital public service and make life less safe for others. There are stories that people could tell you, these are true stories, of instances in which people are moving back into these buildings, having been evicted for serious criminal behavior, and resume a life that terrorizes the way of life for senior citizens and others who don't know how to deal and don't have
the tools, in fact, to deal with this kind of thing. The changes being made today will also provide more autonomy and power to housing providers, as the Minister mentioned, so that they are better able to make those important decisions about housing applications and about future tenants. And those in turn will let TCHC and other housing providers in the province run things better. Minister Clark, along with the Ministry of Housing, have provided some changes to help alleviate the long wait list we currently have for Toronto community housing. Under the new changes, those seeking assistance will prioritize their housing choice and will receive housing that fits their needs. It will help us fill vacant units faster, which will mean those on the wait list are finding homes as quickly as possible. Working with Minister Clark on these issues has been encouraging to me as mayor because it is a great example of different levels of government working together on shared goals. So I want to once again thank the provincial government for coming forward with this new legislation and for working with us on finding a solution. And I want to thank Toronto Community Housing for providing a vital service to residents of our city and for working hard to make sure that people feel safe in their own homes. As Minister Clark said, there is nothing more important than that people should feel safe in their own homes. And I think the measures being announced by the province today and the measures that are being enacted by Toronto Community Housing are going to make a difference in that regard. The Community Housing Corporation is literally investing millions of dollars and taking measures to address places where this has been a particular challenge. Together, we've brought forward changes that will enhance Toronto Community Housing and ensure that we are providing the best and the safest service possible to the people who call Toronto Community Housing their home. Thank you. And I think Kevin is now going to say a word or two, and I will.
Thank you, Mayor Tory, and thank you again, Minister Clark. I just want to take a moment to say a few words. I would like to heartily thank the province of Ontario and the city for listening to our concerns. We have talked about safety and security in our communities and making things simpler for our residents. So thank you for giving us the authority to say no when bad actors that we have already convicted ask for rehousing. It is my belief, and you have heard me say this before, that solving the crime and gang issue that we are experiencing across the city and in our community requires all levels of government working together with community partners and police agencies to solve. And today's announcement is a great example of governments working together to protect law-abiding citizens and their families. And I encourage further discussion in this regard. So again, thank you, Minister Clark. Thank you, Mayor Tory. Thank you, Deputy Mayor Ana Bailào, for your actions and support. I now invite the Minister and the Mayor to join me at the podium and answer any questions you may have.
Formally applies to stay in TCHC unit. So what are you going to do about people who might be a guest of someone who is lawfully in one of these cities? How do you deal with those types of people?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So certainly we will work on those issues. You know, in terms of, you can imagine with 110,000 residents in our communities, that there are many situations that can present themselves as challenging. Part of what we have done in our restructuring efforts is to get decision-making closer to the front lines, to have people who understand their neighborhoods work together in our organization with tenants. And addressing disruptive behavior, whether it's a criminal act or it is an act of an otherwise law-abiding tenant who is disturbing the peaceful enjoyment of others, are issues that we will continue to work on. I don't profess to suggest to you that it will change overnight. This is a journey that we're on, not a destination. And it is our desire to ensure that we continue to improve the livelihoods of our tenants.
May I just say in that regard that one of the real problems we have is, you know, people who may be engaged in criminal behavior may or may not have been evicted for criminal behavior in the past, nonetheless are terrorizing and almost holding hostage, in many cases, senior citizens. And I think that by moving decision-making closer to the buildings themselves where this is going on, it's going to help us to have the information on that. We now have substantially enhanced the millions of dollars I referred to, a lot of it's being spent on substantially enhanced security in the buildings themselves, who will more easily be able to identify people who belong in the building and people who don't. But I think in many cases what we have to count on is more of the neighbors and others who know that a senior is often being taken advantage of and that somebody is coming into their unit and really nobody welcomes them there, including the senior in question, and then engaging in drug dealing and other kinds of activity like this. And we're going to need the kind of the grapevine to get us that information. We're going to need these security people who we're paying for to be in these buildings to get us the information, and a lot more of the decision-making people who are closer to the ground, because that is a big part of this problem too, is people who are not trying to live in the housing, but they're coming as quote-unquote guests, but they're not welcome guests. In many cases, they're forcing themselves on people who live in these buildings, and those people are intimidated about saying anything about it, often seniors. And we've got to work hard, which we're doing, to get rid of that part of the problem as well.
Today's announcement says that starting today, housing providers will have the discretion to turn people away. Can you explain to me how it decided that it would be a discretionary element? How does it get back to your standards, what we can go and say?
Well, from our perspective, we wanted to give the housing providers, like Toronto Community Housing, the opportunity to use these regulations. So we realize that when it comes to housing providers that I deal with all across Ontario, that one size doesn't fit all. That's something that is important here in Toronto, might not be as important or as big a priority in rural Ontario. So when we say that we're giving the discretion, we're allowing in many of these regulations the opportunity for the local housing provider to reflect local conditions.
Hello, for the minister, if I could. I think your government is funding community housing, I think, below what the Liberals had planned. What would you say to people who think maybe the real issue here might be more money needed to fix the badly needed repairs at TCHC?
Well, in a challenging fiscal environment, we ensured in community housing that we had over $1 billion this year. We gave our housing providers their 3-year window for funding, so they know in advance their allocation for next year and the year after. We've also leveraged every single dollar in the system. We've worked with our service managers locally. We've worked with the federal government to ensure that all of the federal programs are incorporated in our allotments over the 3 years. And the lens that we've looked at it in is this, that in a challenging fiscal environment, when dollars are scarce, we want to make sure that they're as flexible as possible so that local providers can make those decisions on their behalf.
Also, Minister, I see your new provision of filling vacant units whereby you have to accept the first one offered to you. Do you think that would pose any challenge with someone perhaps ending up living in a unit but working on the other side of the city, or kids having to go to school a great deal from where their unit would be located?
Well, having a priority list so that we would have a potential tenant choose 3 buildings to me indicates a couple of things. It also gives the housing provider an opportunity to look at the buildings that weren't chosen so that they can use some of the existing programs to help upgrade. So I think it converts the waiting list into more of an access system, which I think in terms of community housing we want to create.
If I can just ask, the mayor afterward, in June, the mayor used a lot of strong language, was upset about the handing down of the tenant to or plan revisions, so there was any consultation, there wasn't any dialogue. Now today, both of you just said that there's a lot of exchange of information
Well, when I took over as minister a year ago, obviously we wanted to ensure that files within the department reflected the new government's priorities. In terms of consultation, over the last several months, I've set up a process with AMO. We had a political process, where we sat down every couple of months. I moved it to every month. And then the TOCA process that I referenced earlier, the Toronto-Ontario Cooperation Consultation Agreement, was a staff table. And I've said to the mayor, and I've said to the deputy mayor as well, I think we need to have something better when it comes to relations with the city of Toronto and the province of Ontario. So we've started a consultation, and I would like to have it much more formalized, where we would regularly sit down on a political level outside of the TOCA table and have those discussions.
And if you are having discussions must involve money to fix the buildings that has been promised by the previous government, rescinded. It's been back and forth for years.
Well, the mayor's been very direct in his, and so is the deputy mayor in their feeling about adequate funds for housing. I appreciate again that in a challenging fiscal environment, we tried to communicate to housing providers that 3-year allocation. Obviously, I'm leading up to the election, I met quite often, my officials met quite often with the federal officials. Again, we want to make sure people who want to access housing don't care which level of government, they expect that we're all going to cooperate, we're all going to get along, and we're going to invest as much money as we can to create a system that people can access.
May I just comment on that to say that I think one of the instances you referred to, the changes made to the Midtown focus, was something where there was not consultation, and the same with, of course, the changing in the size of the municipal council. But I want to say, because today's a day to focus on good news, that subsequent to those events and in recent weeks and months, I've had frequent conversations with, frequent meetings with this minister, and that the environment right now, it doesn't mean we're always going to agree, but it is one of genuine consultation. I hope that continues on the issues we have going forward. We have what I view as some unfinished business at the city's end to see if we can find even more support from the provincial government for the Toronto Community Housing repairs, for example. But there are files that are ongoing works in progress. But I think the consultation that led to this decision today, and that we're having on a number of other matters, including some of the Bill 108 changes and so on, are encouraging to me that the minister himself and the staff of his ministry are sitting with city officials trying to make sure that we make these things happen in a way that achieves the goals of both governments.
So, Mr. Mayor, you're asking for more money from the province for repairs?
We have said from day one, and I think it was even before I was mayor, that the formula that was suggested that seemed to be fair, especially in light of the fact that Toronto Community Housing was downloaded to the city by the provincial government, not this one, but a previous one, was a third, and a third. The city has put up more than a third of what was the outstanding bill when we began the process of seriously repairing Toronto Community Housing. The federal government has come forward with an amount that is equal to a third at least in the form of loans and grants. And we had a start with the previous provincial government under some of the funding that came from cap and trade. But as the minister says, some of the funding they've made available to us, they've made it flexible enough so that we could use it for repairs, but it's a little bit of, if you use it there, you might take it away from somewhere else. So we'll continue a dialogue with them, and the objective would be, yes, to have them assume a third of the responsibility, which we thought was a fair division of the outstanding amount of repairs that had built up over many years of inaction, frankly, by all governments, including the city. But we're now, this year alone, we'll spend $300 million out of property taxpayers' money, bringing our total to more than $1 billion that we have invested on behalf of city taxpayers in those repairs, which are much needed.
Mayor Tory, the agenda for tomorrow's great deal meeting is released and contains a number of confidential attachments. Can you hear me without the mic?
Sort of. I just didn't miss the first little part, but.
Thanks. So the agenda for the great deal has come out, and the materials include a number of references to confidential attachments, including documents related to financial feasibility, funding, and how negotiations will be managed by the city. Do you agree that any materials that better explain this program should be kept off the public record, and why at this stage?
Well, when you're talking about repurposing real estate, which possibly could include a sale of that real estate, it could include other things that involve you in commercial negotiations with third parties. It's very unwise, obviously, to put all your numbers out in advance of having that discussion, because you're then showing your hand to somebody who might be, say, a purchaser of the property. So, while it's unfortunate that it doesn't allow for a complete look at the entire picture at this point in time, obviously any transaction that is entered into with regard to the sale or repurposing of any of the buildings we're talking about will be made public. It's only that you don't give away your negotiating position before you start the negotiations. So I understand why some of this material has been kept confidential. It's commercially sensitive, and I think people would expect us to protect their interests, and protecting their interests includes keeping confidential, for example, valuations we might have had done on property, or even estimated valuations, because you then reduce your negotiating position.
But afterwards, and when the transaction is complete, will we see details on how it was funded and what we were to get from developers and how much the city spent?
Definitely. I mean, whether I thought that was a good idea or not, and I do think it's a very good idea and essential, the requirements of how we do business. I mean, municipal government is the most open level of government at all that we have. I mean, and so everything ultimately is made public, save and except maybe some personnel matters. But you can be sure that if there's a transaction undertaken, whether it's to sell or to lease or to otherwise repurpose any of our real estate, that information will be made public. But I think it's a matter of timing, and I think most people would understand it's unwise when you're talking about dealing with real estate, especially at the very preliminary stage, which is where we are now, to make all these numbers public, because you diminish your own negotiating position, which we're trying to maximize on behalf of the taxpayers.
Minister, just a question about, in terms of this actual announcement, just a question about the timeline. So if somebody was evicted from a TCHC unit 5 years ago, can they still be prevented, 5, 10, 15 years down the road? Or how do you determine if somebody currently poses a threat to the community?
We're allowing local service managers to make those determinations. They're the people on the ground. They know the circumstances within their own building. So we're allowing service managers to deal with implementation of the policy.
But you don't have any set list of criteria. I mean, could this be enforced in perpetuity? I mean, if somebody, let's say, believes themselves to be reformed, if they disavow any kind of criminal activity, will they eventually be allowed to return, or is this something that is permanent?
Again, our policy was to put the hands in the service managers so that they can make the decision on how best to maintain public safety and security within their own buildings.
But wouldn't it be smart, though, for the province to at least spell out, well, okay, we will review this person's file or case maybe 10 years, 20 years on the road?
I think it's best to have the person on the ground who deals with these buildings on a day-to-day basis make the determination on how to best have public safety maintained in that facility.
Last question?
Can I just add a word on that? The assumption of the questions is that discretion will be exercised in such a way that you wouldn't take those kinds of things into account, or that you wouldn't review a file after a number of years. Discretion allows the Toronto Community Housing Authority to exercise that judgment, and as the minister said, they are the closest to the building, they are closest to what went on in the building, they're closest to what the person may have done and when they did it in the past. And so they now have the discretion to deal with those things, and discretion is exercised depending on the facts that are presented to you at the time. So I think, again, this is something that at least now allows us to take obvious cases where people have just been evicted or have been evicted for serious criminal behavior and say, no, you're not coming back in, whereas before we didn't have the discretion to refuse them readmission to the housing. And I think that the discretion will be exercised, I certainly hope, on a sensible, fair-minded basis, but in favor of community safety, which is what this is all about.
And once
do you worry, sir, that, people still need a place to live? I can understand TCHC doesn't want to convict criminals there, but maybe they made a mistake in the past. Do you worry where these people may end up going or make nowhere? Is that a concern?
Obviously, any of those kinds of things are of concern to me, but again, our job is to protect the broader public interest, and to protect the broader interest of the tenants of Toronto Community Housing. When you have an instance in which somebody has been evicted for serious criminal behavior, and now are coming back and asking to be readmitted to that housing, I think it is very fair, and I thank the government for allowing Toronto Community Housing to have the discretion in favor of the broader interests of all the other tenants to say no. And recognizing that could cause a problem for that person, but it's one of those things where you have to put the well-being of many tenants as against that particular problem.
What in that appeals process?
Extension, sir, do you think that's a violation of people's charter of freedoms and expression? What's your take on that?
Again, the broader public interest in this case in public health requires the government to take whatever reasonable means can be taken to ensure that people get vaccinated. If there is a charter case to be argued, then people are free to go to court, as they often do, to take up any rules and challenge them that are put in place by our government or any other government. But I think, again, if you look at the overwhelming evidence that says that vaccines are good for people's health and stop other people from becoming sick, then it is something where that is the thing we will do. We will try to prevent illness and prevent needless deaths. And if people have issues with that, done in a reasonable manner, they will go to court and take it on, and the court will decide what they do.
Minister, I just have a question about the timeline again, because I was just informed that it's a 5-year ban once you've been convicted of something. So if a court hands down a conviction of, let's say, 2.5 years, or 2 years less a day, it's just jail time. Why does TCHC then have a different set of rules if a court has deemed that the crime that you have convicted or been convicted of, this was the sentence that you were given, but TCHC has a 5-year ban? Why is that
why do you guys put that timeline on this?
Again, the impetus of the policy is to ensure that someone who is convicted of a violent crime doesn't immediately go back into a building. It gives all the tools to the service manager to allow them to make that happen. So again, I want to reiterate that in a challenging fiscal environment, we want to be responsive to our community partners. We want to make sure that community safety is paramount in community housing, and that's why we've made this decision.
There have been a lot of calls though to address the actual root causes of gun violence. Do you feel like this helps? in
Well,
that
our
regard?
government's come forward with $25 million over 4 years to be responsive to the city, to the mayor, and to Chief Saunders in terms of some of that. And again, if Attorney General Downey or Solicitor General Jones were here, they would again reiterate, as I'm doing, our commitment to work with our municipal partners and ensure that illegal guns and gangs are dealt with. So we're going to continue to support the city, continue to support our police partners moving forward.
And just maybe one last word on that. Nobody is here today, I don't believe the minister is, I'm not, Mr. Marshman isn't, pretending that this is a solution to gun violence. We've said over and over again, all of us have, there is no one solution to the problem of gun violence. This will help to keep people who have been convicted of serious offenses, including firearms-related offenses, from having a right to be rehoused in the very building from which they were evicted. But we're all working hard together. We've had some very good support from the province, not just with money to help with the police, but also some reforms we're bringing about in the way bail is administered, with special bail courts being set up, and we appreciate that. But there is much, much more to be done by way of better enforcement where the community's interests are taken into account in things like bail decisions within the justice system, by way of further investment in kids and families to make sure that we address some of the root causes of crime, and by way of making sure that the police have in their hands all the tools they need to get the job done. But this is just one more very important step that we have within our Toronto community housing communities to have the discretion to bar people who have previously been evicted already for serious criminal behavior. And I think most people would say that's exactly the right thing to do, and that's certainly the way I feel about it, to give the Housing Corporation the discretion to say no to people who have already been evicted for criminal behavior, that you're not going to come back into these buildings in our discretion and make life unsafe and miserable for the other people who live there.
Last question?
Can I just clarify that, so 5 years, then the housing provider no longer has the discretion to ban it, right? So if I'm in jail for 6 or 7 years, which is the right to that, I'm making back after I was evicted. That's the way things are set. Okay. The other question I had was about the use of your household rather than tenant. I'm assuming there's a lot of situations where it's a family, it's mom with kids. One of the kids goes down the wrong path. Are we contemplating the banning of mom and the other kids because one kid is the problem? Or how does that work? So I would imagine that is a scenario that could happen and would be possible injustice that other people would be thrown out.
And it is a scenario that could happen and does happen. And so what we do is certainly the family is not directly impacted, it's the individual that is impacted. So they're no longer able to come back on these.
Just the one kid.
I mean, yeah, so for example,
I'm 16
if
years
you were
old.
convicted of a crime,
Yeah.
it shouldn't be a problem for your whole family. The issue is yours and you would not be allowed back into the Toronto.
Even if I'm a young offender.
I'm not gonna get into the young offender element of it at this juncture. I think that's something we need to consider. Obviously, this is new legislation, we need to think about it. But the spirit of it, and I echo what Mayor Tory said, is our tenants are sometimes terrorized by criminals. So the reality that we can now keep some of those criminals out for a longer period of time than we could is good for our tenants, and I think it is good for the community, and I think it is the right thing to do.
Is there an
Last
appeals
question.
process beyond the property manager on the ground? Is there an appeals process beyond the decision of the property manager on the ground?
I think, in fact, it isn't the property manager who would necessarily make the decision. It's probably going to rise to a higher level than that. But and I don't think the legislation itself provides for any appeals procedure. We're now given the discretion, and I suppose that would include our board of directors of Toronto Community Housing deciding if there's going to be some process that goes beyond the exercise of that discretion. In other words, is that the last word? But again, it's an exercise of discretion. And so they will be able to take account of all the facts and look at all the prevailing circumstances in making that decision. And whether there's an appeal beyond that is something that I don't think has been decided, because we've been given discretion, and what goes with that, I suppose, is the decision as to whether we have any appeal from that exercise of discretion.
Thank you.
Thank you, folks.
And let me just add on to that, just to clarify this. That this is a new piece of material that we are dealing with today. Obviously, we need to digest it, we need to work with the city, and we need to work with our board and others of how effectively to implement it. So, that dialogue and discussion will continue and happen before we actually implement. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.